Historical records buried deep beneath the Ethelgard archives speak of a night that changed the Lupine dynasties forever. It wasn't a war that shifted the power, but a single, unprecedented act of defiance at the Moon Festival. A forgotten daughter, a cruel scheme, and an Alpha King's ultimate claim. The ancient treaties of the lycanthrope crown, penned in the blood of the first shifters, dictated that the strength of a pack lay in its unbroken lineage. House Whitmore was once the proudest of these bloodlines, holding the vast northern territories of Ethelgard. But history is rarely kind to the honorable. Grace was the last true pureblood of the Whitmore line, though anyone looking at her soot-stained hands and threadbare garments would have easily mistaken her for a lowly human thrall. Born to Lord Harrison Whitmore and his fated mate, Grace had inherited the dormant but devastatingly powerful genetics of the original lunar wolves. However, tragedy struck when she was merely 15. Her mother perished in a rogue attack that many historians now believe was politically orchestrated, and her father, blinded by grief and the heavy burdens of leadership, took a second wife, Lady Margaret of the Caldwell clan. The Caldwells were a lowland pack, wealthy in silver and trade but magically weak, desperate to legitimize their standing by marrying into ancient blood. When Lord Harrison succumbed to a mysterious wasting illness 3 years later, an illness that smelled faintly of wolfsbane and dark alchemy, Lady Margaret wasted no time. The true heir of House Whitmore was quietly, systematically erased from high society. Grace was relegated to the drafty, stone-walled servants' quarters of her own ancestral home. Lady Margaret, a woman whose beauty was as sharp and unforgiving as shattered glass, knew that a pureblood Whitmore wolf would outshine her own daughter, Rosalind. Rosalind was haughty, vicious, and possessed a wolf whose coat was a dull, muddy brown, entirely unremarkable. To ensure Rosalind would secure a high-ranking mate, Margaret enacted a cruel and calculated daily regimen upon her stepdaughter. Every morning, Grace was forced to drink a bitter tea brewed from mountain ash and silver root. This private, highly illegal concoction suppressed Grace's inner wolf, dampening her aura to the point where she registered to other werewolves as little more than a weak, scentless omega. The suppression was physical torture. Grace lived with a constant, dull ache in her bones, her inner beast thrashing against a chemical cage. She cleaned the grand halls she was meant to inherit, polished the silver that burned her skin, and listened in silence as Margaret and Rosalind plotted their social ascensions. The turning point arrived in the autumn of Grace's 21st year, heralded by the blowing of the great horn of Winterborn. The sound echoed across the valleys of Ethelgard, shaking the very pine needles from the trees. It was the summons for the decennial Moon Festival. The Moon Festival was not merely a celebration, it was the most ruthless and vital political arena in the Lupine world. It was held at the High Castle of Morden, hosted by none other than the Alpha King himself, King Alaric of the Winterborn pack. Alaric was a sovereign spoken of in hushed, terrified whispers. He had ascended the throne at a young age after slaughtering a coalition of treasonous alphas who had murdered his father. He was reputed to be a massive, ruthless warrior, a traditionalist who valued strength and loyalty above all. More importantly, King Alaric was 28, and without a Luna, the rumors flying across the continent stated that he intended to finally find his fated mate at this year's festival, or barring fate, choose the strongest female present to bear his heirs. The Whitmore estate was thrown into an absolute frenzy. Lady Margaret drained the estate's coffers, ordering fabrics of spun gold, crushed crimson velvet, and rare pearls from the eastern seas to adorn Rosalind. For weeks, the manor was a chaotic whirlwind of tailors, scent charmers, and etiquette tutors. Rosalind was preened and polished until she shone, her natural scent artificially amplified with expensive jasmine and crushed amber oils, masking the weak, unremarkable odor of her true wolf. Grace watched from the shadows of the scullery, her heart heavy with a silent, gnawing grief. It was during these weeks of preparation that she made a quiet, life-altering decision. One evening, as the cook turned her back, Grace tipped her daily cup of silver root tea into the ashes of the hearth. The withdrawal was agonizing. For 3 days, Grace suffered violent fevers in her freezing attic room. Her joints popped and cracked as her suppressed wolf, dormant for 6 years, began to desperately claw its way to the surface of her consciousness. But with the pain came clarity. Her senses, long muffled, exploded into terrifying sharpness. She could hear the distinct heartbeat of mice in the walls, smell the impending rain miles away, and sense the toxic, cloying jealousy radiating from her stepmother's chambers. Her scent, previously non-existent, began to bloom a mesmerizing, intoxicating fragrance of petrichor, crushed pine needles, and pure, raw moonlight. To hide it, Grace was forced to rub soot and wild garlic over her skin, praying to the moon goddess that Margaret's weakened senses would not detect the predator awakening under her roof. On the eve of the festival, Lady Margaret descended into the kitchens, her eyes narrowed at Grace, who was scrubbing the flagstones. "The carriage leaves at dusk tomorrow," Margaret sneered, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. "You will remain here. The cellar is to be scrubbed top to bottom. If I find a single speck of dust upon our return, you will be whipped with silver-laced leather until your spine shows. Do we understand each other, little human?" Grace kept her head bowed, hiding the glowing, unnatural gold ring that was beginning to bleed into her hazel irises. "Yes, stepmother." But Grace had no intention of scrubbing the cellar. Deep within her mind, a voice that sounded like rumbling thunder and ancient power was pacing back and forth. "We are Whitmore," her wolf growled. "We do not bow to lowland scavengers." The High Castle of Morden was a breathtaking monument to lycanthrope history, carved directly into the side of a colossal mountain. On the night of the Moon Festival, it was ablaze with thousands of torches, casting long, dancing shadows across the snow-dusted courtyards. The air was incredibly thick, vibrating with the aggressive, territorial pheromones of hundreds of alphas, betas, and high-ranking emissaries from across the continent. Lady Margaret and Rosalind arrived in a carriage gilded with the stolen Whitmore crest. Rosalind, draped in an obnoxious crimson gown that practically screamed for attention, linked arms with her mother as they ascended the grand stone steps. Margaret's eyes darted through the crowd, coldly calculating the political standing of every rival family present. Tonight, she was determined to position Rosalind directly in the Alpha King's path. Back at the Whitmore estate, Grace had broken the rusted lock of her attic door with a sudden, terrifying surge of pre-shift strength. Her hands, delicate but now thrumming with raw power, tore through the floorboards beneath her cot. There, hidden years ago by a loyal servant who had since passed, was a cedar chest belonging to her mother. Inside lay the traditional ceremonial garments of the Whitmore purebloods. It was not a gaudy ball gown, but a masterpiece of midnight blue silk, layered under a breathtaking cloak of silver-threaded velvet, designed to move like liquid moonlight. Grace washed the soot and garlic from her skin in the freezing creek behind the manor, letting the icy water shock her system. As she donned the garments, she found a delicate mask, woven of silver wire, a traditional piece meant to honor the moon goddess during the festival's opening rites. She tied it over her eyes, leaving only her lips and her now fiercely glowing golden eyes visible. Grace did not take a carriage. She shifted. For the first time in 6 years, bones broke and rearranged in a beautiful, agonizing symphony. Where a maid had stood, a massive, breathtaking wolf now stood. Her coat was not the dull brown of the Caldwells, nor the standard gray of Kawana wolves. It was a blinding, pristine white, shimmering with a pearlescent sheen that marked the ancient lunar bloodline. She ran through the dense Ethelgard forests, covering a 2-day carriage journey in a matter of hours, fueled by the intoxicating magic of the full moon hanging heavy in the sky. She shifted back to human form at the edge of the Morden grounds, slipping her silk dress and silver cloak back on, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't know why she had come. It wasn't for the king. It was for her right to exist, her right to stand in the halls of her ancestors. Inside the grand hall, the tension had reached a fever pitch. The heavy oak doors at the top of the sweeping double staircase groaned open, and a hush violently fell over the thousands of attendees. King Alaric stepped into the light. He was a terrifying vision of absolute dominance. Standing well over 6 feet, his broad shoulders were draped in a heavy pelt of black fur. He wore a tailored suit of dark obsidian, but it did nothing to civilize the raw, predatory danger radiating from him. His jaw was clenched, his sharp, aristocratic features set in a mask of bored lethargy. His eyes, a piercing, icy blue, scanned the crowd below. Every wolf in the room instinctively bared their necks, a subconscious submission to the sheer, crushing weight of his alpha aura. Slowly, deliberately, Alaric began to descend the stairs. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. He walked through the lines of desperate, hopeful females, his nose barely flinching. He smelled greed, ambition, fear, and cheap perfumes. His wolf, a dark and violent beast within him, remained entirely unbothered, curled up in disappointed slumber. Lady Margaret, seeing the king approaching their sector of the hall, grabbed Rosalind's arm. "Now," she hissed. "Step forward, drop your eyes, bare your neck." Just as Rosalind moved to block the aisle, a sudden commotion rippled at the back of the hall. The heavy entry doors had slipped open, admitting a gust of freezing night air, and with the wind came a scent. King Alaric froze. The heavy crystal goblet in his hand suddenly cracked under his tightening grip. His head snapped up, his icy blue eyes dilating until they were almost entirely black. Deep within his soul, his beast didn't just wake, it roared, throwing itself against the confines of his mind. Mate! The scent was overwhelming. It cut through the sickening sweetness of 1,000 perfumes like a silver blade. It was wild rain, ancient forests, and a sweetness that made Alaric's fangs instantly ache to lengthen. He ignored the stunned murmurs of the crowd and began to march down the hall, his strides long and predatory. Lady Margaret, entirely oblivious to the king's true target, saw him walking directly toward where she and Rosalind stood near the back columns. Her heart soared with malicious triumph. It had worked. Grace, having just slipped past the guards, stood frozen near those very columns, trying to catch her breath. The sheer presence of the Alpha King's aura was pressing heavily against her chest. When she looked up, she saw the king walking straight toward her sector. Panic flared in Grace's chest. She took a step back, trying to blend into the velvet drapes. Lady Margaret, noticing a hooded, masked figure suddenly stepping into the space she had carefully cleared for Rosalind, completely lost her composure. Blinded by ambition, Margaret viciously shoved the masked girl aside. "Out of the way, you insolent wretch," Margaret spat under her breath, pushing Grace hard against the stone pillar. Grace stumbled, her silver hood falling back, exposing her cascades of auburn hair and the delicate silver mask framing her glowing eyes. King Alaric let out a guttural, terrifying snarl that reverberated off the vaulted ceilings. The music stopped instantly. Several weaker wolves collapsed to their knees in sheer terror. He closed the remaining distance in a blur of motion. Margaret, sporting a triumphant smile, pushed Rosalind forward. "Your Majesty," Margaret began, curtsying deeply. Alaric didn't even look at her. He didn't register Rosalind's existence. He stepped cleanly around the bowing stepmother, his massive frame looming over the girl pressed against the stone pillar. Grace looked up, her breath catching in her throat as the Alpha King of Ethelgard boxed her in. Up close, he was overwhelming. The heat rolling off his body was immense. Alaric reached out, his large, calloused hand trembling slightly. He didn't ask for permission. He gently, almost reverently, took Grace's soot-stained, calloused hand in his. He lifted her knuckles to his lips, his eyes locked fiercely onto hers, burning with possessive, unyielding fire. "I have searched for you across lifetimes," Alaric rumbled, his voice rough with emotion, loud enough for every silent, stunned aristocrat in the hall to hear. He turned, pulling Grace to his side, intertwining his fingers with hers, and glared coldly at the horrified Lady Margaret. "And whoever dared to push my queen into the shadows will not live to see the dawn." The silence in the great hall of Morden was absolute, a suffocating vacuum where not a single soul dared to draw breath. Lady Margaret's perfectly painted face drained of all color, leaving her resembling a hollowed-out porcelain doll. The Alpha King's words hung in the frigid air, heavy with a promise of brutal, unyielding retribution. Margaret's calculated mind fractured under the weight of the impossible reality unfolding before her. The masked girl, trembling in the Alpha King's possessive hold, could not be Grace. It was statistically, magically, and physically impossible. The daily doses of silver root tea should have kept her stepdaughter's wolf in a comatose state for another decade. Yet, as the intoxicating scent of petrichor and raw moonlight washed over the terrified crowd, overpowering the synthetic perfumes of the high-born ladies, Margaret recognized the undeniable truth. The heir of House Whitmore had broken her chains. "Your Majesty, there is a grave misunderstanding," Margaret stammered, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of its usual aristocratic velvet. She stepped forward, ignoring the warning growl that ripped through King Alaric's massive chest. This creature you hold is no queen. She is a lowly scullery maid from my own estate, a deceitful, treacherous Omega who has sneaked into this sacred festival wearing stolen garments." Rosalind, trembling behind her mother, finally found her voice. "She speaks the truth, my king. That is Grace. She is nothing but dirt beneath our boots. She has no rank, no power, and her wolf is as pathetic as a newborn pup." The murmurs erupted instantly. The nobility of Ethelgard loved nothing more than a scandal, and the accusation that the Alpha King's fated mate was an unranked servant sent a shockwave of scandalous whispers echoing against the vaulted stone ceilings. To the rigid, traditionalist society of the lycanthropes, mating with a wolf beneath the rank of beta was considered a disgrace. Mating with a servant was an abomination that could challenge a king's right to rule. King Alaric's grip on Grace's hand did not loosen. If anything, his thumb stroked her calloused knuckles with an agonizingly tender reverence that sharply contrasted the murderous fury in his icy blue eyes. He looked at Margaret as one might look at a venomous insect, waiting to be crushed under a heavy boot. "You dare speak to me of rank?" Alaric's voice was a low seismic rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very flagstones. "You, a lowland scavenger who married into ancient blood, only to dilute it with your mediocrity?" Before Alaric could summon his royal guards to drag the Caldwell women to the dungeons, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of a wooden staff echoed through the hall. The crowd parted respectfully, though fearfully, as Elder Reginald stepped forward. Reginald was the head of the High Council, a monstrously old wolf whose pelt was silvered with age, and whose authority, technically, rivaled the king's in matters of ancient law. "My king," Elder Reginald rasped, his cloudy eyes fixed on the masked girl. "The Caldwell woman's insolence aside, the laws of the decennial moon festival are clear. Any female who stands before the king must state her lineage and reveal her face. Furthermore, if she is accused of foul play, the council must investigate. A fated bond is sacred, yes, but dark magic and alchemical love charms have deceived alphas before." Margaret's eyes lit up with desperate, malicious hope. "Yes, witchcraft. She has used illegal blood magic to alter her scent and bewitch the king. Look at her hands, they are scarred from labor, not from training. She is a fraud." Grace felt a cold spike of panic pierce her chest. She was keenly aware of the dirt still trapped beneath her fingernails, the burns from harsh lye soap on her wrists, and the undeniable fact that she had scrubbed floors just a day prior. She instinctively tried to pull her hand from Alaric's grasp, wanting to spare him the humiliation of defending a broken maid. But Alaric refused to let go. He turned to her, his massive frame shielding her from the predatory stares of the court. "Do not hide from them," he whispered, his tone incredibly soft, meant only for her ears. "They are nothing but dust in the wind compared to what you are. Show them, my little wolf. Show them the blood they thought they could bury." Grace looked into his piercing blue eyes. There was no pity there, no hesitation. There was only absolute, unshakable devotion and a feral demand for her to claim her birthright. The dormant beast within Grace, fully awakened by the bond and fueled by years of suppressed agony, roared in agreement. Slowly, Grace reached up with her free hand. She untied the silver ribbon at the back of her head and let the delicate wire mask fall to the marble floor. The metallic clatter echoed loudly in the tense silence. Gasps ripped through the crowd. Many of the older lords and ladies who had known Lord Harrison immediately recognized the striking aristocratic bone structure, the cascades of rich auburn hair, and, most importantly, the eyes. Grace's irises were no longer their human hazel. They were blazing, luminescent rings of molten gold, a genetic marker so rare it hadn't been seen in 3 generations. "Grace Whitmore," Elder Reginald breathed, dropping his wooden staff. It clattered against the stone, completely forgotten. "By the goddess, the true heir." "She is a half-breed, a weakling!" Margaret shrieked, losing whatever remained of her sanity. She lunged forward, producing a concealed, silver-laced dagger from the folds of her gown, an act of high treason in the presence of the king. "I will not let this wretch ruin my daughter's future." Margaret aimed the poisoned blade directly at Grace's throat, moving with the desperate speed of a cornered animal. King Alaric moved to intercept, his fangs descending, but he didn't need to. Grace did not cower. The years of abuse, the chemical torture, the silent tears in the dark, all of it transmuted into pure, blinding power. She released her aura. It did not hit the room like the aggressive, crushing weight of an alpha male. Instead, it swept through the great hall like an avalanche of ice and moonlight. It was suffocatingly beautiful, ancient, and utterly dominant. The sheer, concentrated pressure of a true lunar pureblood snapped the silver dagger in Margaret's hand before the blade even came within a foot of Grace. Margaret was thrown backward violently, landing in a heap of crushed velvet at the base of the staircase. Rosalind fell to her knees, choking, her hands clutching her throat as the overwhelming scent of petrichor drove her weak wolf into total submission. Across the massive hall, hundreds of proud alphas and betas found their knees buckling, forced to bow their heads to a power that had ruled Ethelgard before the current monarchies were even established. Grace stood tall, her silver cloak billowing around her despite the lack of wind in the hall. "I am Grace of House Whitmore," she declared, her voice resonating with an unnatural, dual timbre, the voice of the woman and the rumbling growl of her white wolf speaking as one. "And I have scrubbed the blood of my ancestors from the stones of my own home for the last time." The immediate aftermath of Grace's display of power was absolute pandemonium, swiftly followed by a terrifying, synchronized order imposed by the royal guard. At King Alaric's sharp command, heavily armored winterborn soldiers surged into the hall, their heavy boots cracking against the marble. Captain Gideon, a hulking warrior with a face mapped by battle scars, hauled Lady Margaret from the floor by the scruff of her ruined gown. Rosalind was seized next, sobbing hysterically as the cold iron cuffs clamped around her wrists. "Treason," Alaric's voice boomed, projecting easily over the chaotic murmurs of the stunned nobility. He stepped down to stand shoulder to shoulder with Grace, ensuring every wolf in the room saw them as a united, impenetrable front. "Attempted assassination of a royal mate in the king's own hall. Lady Margaret, your arrogance has finally eclipsed your meager intelligence." "She is an impostor!" Margaret spat, blood dribbling from her lip where she had bitten it in her fall. Her eyes were wild, darting around the room, begging the High Lords for intervention. But the Lords of Ethelgard were cowards in the face of true power. They kept their heads bowed, refusing to meet her gaze. "She is a defect. I protected House Whitmore from her weakness." "You protected nothing but your own greed?" Elder Reginald stepped forward, his tone grave. The old wolf had retrieved his staff, and now looked upon Grace with a mixture of awe and deep sorrow. For years, rumors circulated about Lord Harrison's sudden demise and the convenient disappearance of his pure-blood daughter. We suspected, but we lacked proof. To suppress a lunar wolf is a violation of the oldest treaties. It is spiritual mutilation. "And the proof of her father's murder?" Alaric demanded, his eyes narrowing. He looked toward the darkened alcoves of the hall. "Summon Madame Beatrice." The crowd parted once more as a diminutive, frail woman draped in heavy gray shawls was led forward. Madame Beatrice was a lichened seer, a rare wolf whose psychic connection to the moon goddess allowed her to taste the echoes of the past in the blood of the present. Beatrice approached Grace, her blind, milky white eyes staring into the distance. "May I, my queen?" she rasped softly. Grace glanced at Alaric, who gave a firm, reassuring nod. She offered her hand to the old seer. The moment Beatrice's calloused fingers brushed against Grace's skin, the seer gasped violently. Her head snapped back, and she began to speak, but the voice that echoed from her throat was not her own. It was a chaotic symphony of whispers, the dying breaths of Lord Harrison. "The tea. Tastes of ash. Margaret, my chest burns. Protect my Grace." The phantom voice of the late Lord Whitmore echoed through the great hall, dripping with agony and betrayal. The seer collapsed, caught swiftly by Captain Gideon. The silence that followed was heavy with the stench of Margaret's guilt. The undeniable proof of regicide and treason hung in the air, damning the Caldwell women beyond any hope of salvation. "Take them to the Black Tower," King Alaric commanded. his voice devoid of any mercy. They will face the tribunal at dawn, though the sentence is already written in the blood they spilled. Strip the Caldwell clan of their titles, seize their assets, and banish the rest of their bloodline to the barren outlands. Margaret screamed, a horrid, scratching sound that echoed off the stone walls as the guards dragged her backward. Rosalind merely wept, a pathetic, broken sound, mourning the loss of the glittering future she had falsely believed was hers. Their cries faded down the long, torch-lit corridors, leaving the great hall in a stunned, breathless quiet. Alaric turned his attention back to the crowd. Tonight was meant to be a festival of unity, he declared, his gaze sweeping over the lords and ladies who had stood by while a pureblood was forced into servitude. Let it be known that a new era begins tonight. The rot within our ranks will be burned out. Strength is not found in deception, but in the truth of our blood. He then turned to Grace. The terrifying, ruthless Alpha King melted away, leaving only a fiercely devoted mate. He cupped her face with both hands, ignoring the soot that still clung to her jawline, seeing only the radiant, indomitable woman who had survived hell. "Grace," Alaric murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "you have fought your battles in the dark for far too long. From this night forward, you will never scrub another floor. You will never hide your scent, and you will never walk alone." He dropped to one knee. The sight of the monstrous, unyielding king of Winterborn kneeling before a woman dressed in ancient, unpolished silk sent a fresh wave of shock through the court. "I, Alaric of Winterborn, Alpha King of Ethelgard, pledge my life, my pack, and my crown to you. I ask you to be my Luna, my equal, and my queen. Will you take my hand, not as a desperate escape, but as my fated partner?" Grace looked down at the fearsome warrior kneeling before her. The years of isolation, the bitter tea, the freezing attic, it all washed away in the warmth of his gaze. Her wolf purred, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in her chest. She reached out, her glowing golden eyes softening, and placed her hand securely in his. "I will," Grace said, her voice clear and ringing with newfound authority. "I accept you, Alaric, and I accept my crown." Alaric stood, pulling her flush against his chest, and crashed his lips down upon hers. The kiss was a collision of ancient magic and raw, desperate relief. The bond snapped perfectly into place, a brilliant explosion of warmth and light that flooded their senses. A blinding shockwave of pure alpha and pure blood energy blasted through the room, extinguishing the torches for a brief, breathless second before they flared back to life with an intense, magical brightness. The court of Ethelgard dropped to their knees in perfect, unquestioning synchronization. They bowed not just to the king they feared, but to the long-lost queen who had returned from the ashes to claim her rightful throne. The Moon Festival had indeed changed the dynasties forever, forging a reign that would go down in lycanthrope history as the golden era of the Winterborn king and his unbreakable Whitmore queen. Did the dramatic twists of Grace's revenge and her powerful fated bond with the Alpha King keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved this medieval werewolf romance as much as we did, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this story with your fellow fantasy lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more epic, real-life inspired supernatural dramas every single week.